things that I think we all would recognize is the fact that uh, something has occurred in our educational system that uh, has been unfortunate because teachers are expected to cover so many specific things in their classroom curriculum. And sadly, as a result, some things don't always get much coverage in the class. And so we end up, as I think all of you would recognize, with young people who don't know a whole lot, especially about Kentucky history in a lot of cases. And we've also reached a time that not a lot of young people really understand who Alben W. Barkley was, what he accomplished, and all of the things that he did for the people of Kentucky as well as the entire country. One of the yeah, we can all enjoy the story of Alben Barkley in books such as Dear Alben and the Alben Barkley, A Life in Politics book that's a little more recent. And those scholarly works are wonderful, and yet they gloss over some of the aspects of Alben Barkley's life for roughly 2 years between the death of Dorothy Barkley and the Veep getting married again. And that's what this is about. Now, one of the ways that we uh, know as much about this as we do is the fact that Jane Rucker Barkley wrote her memoirs uh, after the Veep died. And that book is entitled I Married the Veep. What a great title. And it didn't have great reviews. She used a ghostwriter. There was a lot of speculation whether the story was more the ghostwriter's words or Jane's words. Um, it's wordy, but it's folksy, humorous, and I believe it does allow Jane's personality to shine through as she tells her story of her life with the Veep. Uh, One of the things that critics really were unhappy about was the book is filled with hundreds of quotations of conversations. And they pointed out, and I obviously recognized as well, there's no way a person could possibly remember every single sentence that was uttered between multiple people for a number of years and then regurgitate them to use them as quotations in the book. So uh, it didn't go over so well. That book today is hard to find. If you check online sources, one, you can't buy it. There are a few copies in institutions in places like Paducah, the University of Kentucky, and much to my surprise, I found a copy right here in my neighborhood in neighboring Metcalfe County. And it hasn't been checked out too often. Four times in almost 60 years. So it wasn't a book that a lot of people were uh, just dying to get their hands on. One of the things that is interesting about Jane's approach is that she didn't discuss politics so much. She discussed their relationship and the intricacies of the Veep and how it all came to be that she married this man. Uh, Alben Barkley had found himself uh, at almost the pinnacle of his political career, uh, standing by himself. Dorothy Brower Barkley had suffered a heart attack in 1942, and her physician had advised that she had maybe 2 years to live. She lived an uncomfortable existence, being short of breath, uh, having chest discomfort, constant fatigue. She couldn't go up and down the steps of their home. So the Barclays sold their two-story home, moved to an apartment on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, and eventually Dorothy's health deteriorated to the point that she was an invalid and required around the clock nursing care. As we would all know in today's world, that is a very costly thing. Alben Barkley was making roughly $10,000 a year at that time for his uh, work in Washington, and that did not cover enough. It didn't bring in enough income to pay for Dorothy's care. So, like a good enterprising Kentuckian, he actively sought speaking engagements because he was a popular speaker. He was entertaining, he was folksy, he was humorous, and people enjoyed listening to him. And so he found that he could line up speaking engagements around the country, and he crisscrossed the country weekly, uh, going to give speeches at night every weekend and during the time that Congress was recessed. And those who recognized what Alvin was doing in order to make enough money to pay for Dorothy's care were amazed that he was able to maintain that schedule, that he was, flying back into Washington on a red eye at 3 o'clock in the morning, and yet he would be on the Senate floor first thing that same morning. In 1947, Dorothy had a massive stroke and she slipped into a coma and died in March of 1947. Then we, of course, know that Alvin Barkley was elected vice president with Harry S. Truman. And 1949 was quite a year for Barkley and for the lady who would become his bride. He was inaugurated, of course, on January the 20th. And for nearly 2 years, he was referred to as the country's most eligible bachelor. He was the only sitting vice president to marry while serving in that capacity. And the press kept tabs on his doings, and any woman in his presence was immediately the subject of speculation about what sort of relationship they had. In the Truman White House, uh, Clark Clifford was the president's legal advisor, and obviously from Missouri, as you might have suspected. He and his wife, Marnie, were friends of Carlton Hadley and his 37-year-old widow, Jane Rucker Hadley. And naturally, the thing to do if you've got a wonderful position in the White House, you're going to invite your friends from back home to come visit you and to show off a little bit. And that was exactly what happened when Clifford and uh, uh, Marnie invited Jane to come to Washington, D.C. on a 4-day jaunt. Uh, Jane had gone to work as a widow as a secretary for a local company in St. Louis. And on the first night of Jane's visit to Washington, the Cliffords borrowed the presidential yacht, which Jane described in her memoirs as not very impressive, with little rope railings that were more like the size of a new clothesline. And that kind of gives us a little bit of insight into how humorous she might be at times. But the president had changed the name of the presidential yacht from the Williamsburg to Margie in honor of his daughter, Margaret Truman. And they were to take a cruise down the Potomac River. The Cliffords hadn't quite just invited uh, Jane along. When she arrived, she learned that the other guests on that excursion would be the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, the Undersecretary of Commerce, Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney, who, of course, maintained a Kentucky home and horse farm in Lexington, the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, Baron Silvercruise, the Belgian ambassador to the U.S., Senators William Fulbright of Arkansas and Millard Tydings of Maryland, the Dean of Washington Journalists, Arthur Krock, who was a native of Glasgow, Kentucky. The Cliffords' house guests, of course, Jane Rucker Hadley, and the vice president. Jane recalled on that evening that she had been a widow for 5 years at that point. She had not been in Washington, D.C. since 1938. So lots of things had changed. And she explained that she had sort of moved out of the phase of widowhood where she was wearing a wardrobe almost exclusively black, and that she was feeling kind of smart, wearing a white sheath dress that was very stylish for this party. Uh, Jane's memoirs revealed some interesting things about that cruise down the Potomac with this cast of characters. Um, she was excited to meet all of them. They were obviously impressive, important, powerful people. And she was certainly thrilled that a girl from St. Louis, a secretary, was going to be meeting the Vice President of the United States. Uh, she explained that she found him charming, but she also explained that he held her hand a little too long when they first met, and eventually she continued in her memoirs that she found him to be just a little too fresh. And according to Jane, Alben wore a white linen suit, black and white spectator shoes, a neat, beautifully tied necktie, a spotless handkerchief peeking from his breast pocket, and a Panama hat. She described him as being meticulously dressed, not like a fashion plate, but a man who was incredibly, unbelievably immaculate in every way. And she was a little overwhelmed, of course, meeting the vice president. And when she finally extracted her hand from his, after what she considered too long a period of time, Alben Barkley promptly grabbed her elbow and guided her to a more private place to chat on the yacht. Those two chatted. I don't think Jane felt it went very well. She wasn't quite sure how what the president or the vice president was up to, but they learned several things that they had in common. They were both widowed. They each had two daughters. They both had learned shorthand and used that skill to earn extra money early in their careers, and that Alben had served in Congress with Jane's grandfather, Congressman Rucker of Missouri. She felt she was maybe being a little bit rude to the other guests by continuing this lengthy conversation with the vice president, so she extracted herself and moved to another part of the boat, simply disappeared of sorts. Um, it was during that time that Alben Barkley prepared two plates of food at the buffet, one for Jane, and one for himself. But the problem was Jane didn't return. William Fulbright was a close friend of Alben's, and he recognized that something was terribly wrong with the Veep. He was clearly upset, he was red faced, and he believed that Jane had cut him off, and he was not happy about that. Bill Fulbright intervened, found Jane, and explained the situation, and that there had perhaps been some mixed signals, and that for goodness sakes, go and apologize to the vice president and make him understand that you weren't cutting him off. She did just that, and so all was right with the world again. And at the time she uh, was beside him on the yacht, the group had started a sing along, and the song that they were singing was Some Enchanted Evening. Jane was a little bit smitten, but she still wasn't sure about this gentleman. She concluded that Alben's nickname of the Veep, which had been bestowed on him by his grandson, might actually stand for very estimable, eligible prospect. So the next day of Jane's visit to the capital city rolls around, and What should happen first thing the next morning? The vice president calls the Clifford home and asks to speak to Jane. He wanted to invite the Cliffords and Jane to dinner the following night. And unfortunately, the Cliffords had already made plans to entertain their guest, but they in turn invited the vice president to join them the following night. But in the meantime, the Cliffords were taking Jane to a party at Gwendolyn Cafritz's home. And who should happen to be at that event but the charming Kentuckian who lured Jane outside to the terrace for yet another conversation? The third evening, Jane and the Cliffords were once again with the vice president, who arrived with a beribboned bottle of sherry for Marnie Clifford and a box of candy for Jane. And by this time, Marnie had realized all that seemed to be going on in this uh, sudden friendship between the vice president and Jane, and she had nicknamed Alben Barkley Sparkle Barkle. While the house was filled with people, the vice president somehow had a way to lure Jane away from the crowd, and this time it was to a terrace. And she recalled that he spoke of his immense loneliness and how much he missed Dorothy and having that companionship. And that was something, of course, Jane could empathize with in her own situation. The two stayed on the terrace talking for so long that the Cliffords' guest gave up on getting to tell the president goodbye and wait until he had departed the occasion. And all the guests left. It had grown so late. Marty and Clark Clifford gave up waiting on Jane and Albert on the terrace and went to bed. Uh, the clever Marnie left a note on the living room mantel where she knew that they would see it, and that note explained that they were sorry for the faux pas of everyone departing before the vice president, the guest of honor, had done so, but added that it's late and some of us have to go to work tomorrow. While seeing the vice president out the door of the Clifford home, the Veep kissed her on the cheek. And she was mortified when she realized that the front door was standing open, and peering into the Clifford home and witnessing that quick uh, act was the president's chauffeur, who had been waiting all of these hours with the limousine. Um, Alban Barkley brushed it off and just chuckled and said everything would be okay. So we come to the fourth day of Jane's 4-day visit, and the vice president called again. And this time he sort of sent Jane into a tailspin because he explained that he wanted to host a luncheon in the U.S. Senate in her honor. And the problem was that Jane was supposed to be leaving, and she was a very dedicated employee and worried that she was neglecting her job back in St. Louis, and that, what if she were fired for not coming back to work after 4 days? Instead, Marnie Clifford convinced her that it would be terrible to turn down such an invitation, that was not anything that happened just every day. And she nervously called her employer and discreetly explained the situation, and asked that he not share what was going on in Washington with her coworkers. But obviously, he gave his blessing to her extension of her visit. So Jane writes in her memoirs about this event. It was an unlikely place to start a courtship, but then everything that happened to me in 1949 was highly unlikely. It was, for example, highly unlikely that a secretary would be feted at the Capitol of the United States by the vice president. But it actually happened, and it happened at noon on Wednesday, July 13th, 1949. I had always thought the number 13 an unlucky one. I don't think that any longer because on the 13th day of July 1949, Alben Barkley began to court me. Well, lunch wasn't the end of the Veep's entertaining of Jane. That evening, he hosted a cocktail party at his apartment. It was the first occasion that he had entertained anyone in the apartment since Dorothy's death. Um, his daughters had filled in as hostesses to be beside him and attend various functions, but this was the first time that he had welcomed people into his home um, in 2 years. And he had the help of his cook, Lulu, and his valet, Parker. And he managed to have a country ham straight from the Angles in Paducah prepared, along with all the trimmings for a small feast for his guests. It was also an opportunity for his younger daughter, Laura, to meet Jane. Daughter Marion Barkley Truitt was typically the one more apt to be with Alben, but she had broken her toe and she couldn't leave her farm in Maryland, so Laura fills in. Now, as a part of this cocktail party, the Veep insisted that he give a personal tour of the apartment to Jane, and that included a slightly prolonged stop in the kitchen, and that stolen moment gave the vice president an opportunity to quickly kiss Jane. And it also just so happened at that very moment, his daughter Laura walked through the door. So Jane was again mortified. She was convinced that she had made a terrible impression on Laura Barkley and worried that this was just going to be a disaster. And it wasn't. The day wasn't over still because later in the evening, the Cliffords, Jane, and the vice president appeared at the Shoreham Hotel where they danced until the wee hours of the morning. Now, the next morning, unlike the previous mornings, it was not the vice president to first call the Clifford home asking to speak with Jane Rucker. Instead, it was President Harry S. Truman who summons Jane to the White House for a brief private visit. He simply wanted to meet the woman Alben Barkley had fallen for in a matter of just a few days, 5. Leaving the White House, Jane and the Cliffords visited Barkley in the Capitol, and he thought it would be in order for him to serve mint juleps in his office as a toast to his home state of Kentucky before she departed for St. Louis. The Veep had lots of ideas. He had orchestrated with the Cliffords that they would drive their car with Jane's luggage, but not Jane. And he arranged that Jane would ride in his car with him to the train station. And upon arrival at the train station, uh, the vice president boarded the train to personally inspect Jane's quarters to make sure they were safe for her and that everything was satisfactory. And of course, soon it had spread through the train that the vice president had brought this woman and seemed to be escorting her. Uh, Here again, Jane's memoirs reveal that finally Alben had a chance to truly kiss Jane Rucker. And it was the one time that that happened undetected and completely uninterrupted. Jane is back in St. Louis, and she had memorized the Veep schedule and noted that he had no speaking engagements, no reason to be in the Midwest that might allow him to make a stop in St. Louis. And she found that very deflating. But within a week, the Veep had found a way to plan an unplanned visit to St. Louis. for dinner with Jane on a Sunday evening. He joked that perhaps his plane would have, quote, engine trouble, and that would be the cause for the unusual, unplanned landing in St. Louis. Jane was at the ready. She found friends who were willing to open their home and host a dinner for the Vice President of the United States on a couple of days' notice. Uh, it would be wonderful to have friends like Jane's because it seems that her friends certainly rose to the occasion to help make all of this happen. Jane had assured Barkley that there would be no press. He didn't have to worry about their picture being made. Anyone no one would ever know that he had even been in the city. Um, she got out her mother's old car and had it serviced. She drove it to the airport to a landing strip where private planes landed, and the next thing she knew, the plane opened, and Alben Barkley uh, jumped from the plane, taking two steps at a time, almost running to greet her. And she put him in the car and whisked him away. No Secret Service, no staff. They didn't know where he was going. They didn't really know who this woman was, but this is what was happening. And it caused a bit of a stir because they had such a good time with the friends with this Sunday dinner and visiting afterwards that they returned to the airport 4 hours after the plane was to have left for Washington. His entourage was frantic. Again, they had turned the vice president of the United States loose with a woman they really didn't know to take him somewhere in a secret location, and now they're 4 hours late. And they were obviously concerned that this could be not good, needless to say. Uh, Jane's assurance of complete discretion didn't work as she had planned. On Monday morning, the front page of the St. Louis newspaper had 3-inch tall letters announcing Veep visits St. Louis widow. Alben subsequently wrote to Jane, Dear Jane, I am wondering what has happened to a man when he cannot dismiss from his mind the image or the memory of a woman who has come up over the horizon of his life. Do you know? That is precisely what has happened to me. I was immeasurably proud of you yesterday, proud that I know you, proud of what you are, proud of all the things that combine to make you what you are. I was also proud of the great love and respect your friends feel for you. It seems that I have always known you, and I'm wondering why I have not. You gave me a happy day. I enjoyed your friends and hope they were not too much bored with me. If not, let's do it again. As ever and always, Veep. While the furor of the Sunday visit to St. Louis had died down, Barkley is off visiting places as normal. One of those places was Culpeper, Virginia, where they were celebrating the community's bicentennial. And as a part of that celebration, a queen was to be crowned as part of the ceremonies. And as you would guess, the Veep was the designated person to crown the queen, and he did. But with all of these reporters and photographers present, he literally turned to them and said, some of these days, I'm going to crown a queen of my own. Within hours, those comments hit newspapers around the country. Radio broadcasters were quick to air the remark from coast to coast. Soon, the gossip of the nation was that the queen the Veep had in mind of crowning resided in St. Louis. And by now, Alben Barkley had become known as the Merry Widower. So, needless to say, the whole country was sort of following this from a distance thanks to the media. Just a few days later, Alben was visiting Angles, his farm in McCracken County, and Jane was 45 minutes away in St. Louis. She suggested that he drive to St. Louis and she would arrange with her friend, who happened to be the president of the St. Louis Cardinals team, for tickets. Not only did the man provide tickets, he provided closed streets, an entourage to welcome the vice president, a press area was set up, and the Veep was scheduled to throw out the first ball. Jane had finally become adept in a matter of a couple of weeks at this point at responding with, quote, no comment. Alban always had this wonderful relationship with the press, and he had what Jane referred to a tendency to break loose. Soon after the baseball visit, Alban was addressing a group of Democratic Party workers, and President Truman was present. Uh, the vice president had arrived a bit late, and he, when he got to the podium and his opportunity to speak, he said, "Mr. President, I am sorry I'm a bit late, but when I awoke from my nap this evening, I recalled that I had some unfinished business out in Missouri. I called Missouri over the long distance telephone, and she asked me to give you her best." Truman, the guests, the media all caught the meaning of what he had said, and the building was rocking with laughter and applause, and the newspaper reporters sent that information throughout the country in yet another of the Merry Widower exploits. Soon, Jane Rucker Hadley came to be known as the, quote, the Missouri Matter. Random news stories and gossip columnists speculated if there would be a wedding and if so, when. Numerous reporters claimed that they had inside information and began even quoting specific dates for the wedding. The vice president would call Jane and ask her if she was aware that they were supposed to get married on various dates, and they decided to just simply have fun with it and go right along. The Washington Post commented, Mr. Barkley, having plunged with what is best described as boyish enthusiasm into the giddy social whirl of this capital, is maintaining a pace that leaves the hardiest young debutante and the most athletic of dancing men gasping with envy. One day we hear that Mr. Barkley is eating state dinners, downing mint juleps, and dancing till all hours of the night. The next day he is lunching with pretty widows in St. Louis, and next that he's kissing and re-kissing Virginia beauties in Culpeper. Now he talks about crowning a beauty queen of his own and settling down. Now he takes it all back and says how painful it is to be burdened with a sense of humor because people always think you're serious. We certainly don't begrudge Mr. Barkley his fun, but hanged if we can see how he keeps it up in this weather. Later in the summer of 1949, uh, Alban flies Jane and his daughters to Paducah to join him for the dedication of Barkley Field. And at this event, Jane became a focus, and it was an opportunity for Barkley to introduce Jane to his Paducah friends, and he even insisted that she sit on the platform with him and his daughters for that event. In the meantime, the vice president is writing to Jane nearly every day. Many of his letters were written from the rostrum of the U.S. Senate, while unbeknownst to the senators and staff who were busily working on the Senate floor, the vice president was writing Jane each day. Alban's first visit to Jane's apartment was on her 38th birthday. She had a small apartment in St. Louis. Her mother lived with her. She had teenage daughters who lived with her. And throughout all of this summer, her mother had been visiting the Adirondacks. One daughter was in California with relatives, and the other daughter was away with social and college activities. So it hadn't worked out. She didn't want to entertain the vice president uh, at her apartment with that situation. She wanted those people who were important in her life to be there when he visited. So on her birthday um, is the first time that Ethel Rucker, Jane's mother, got to meet the Veep, and of course they hit it off. He arrived with what was described as a bulging briefcase. And eventually he said he brought a gift, and he produced a package containing a book entitled Women Are Here to Stay. That was a hit. A little bit later, he produced another package from the briefcase. This time it was handkerchiefs and a large bottle of perfume. And then there was another package that he managed to pull from the briefcase, and it contained a new alligator handbag. Later in the evening, he finally pulled from the briefcase another box, this one containing a diamond watch. Uh, Alben had suggested that Mrs. Rucker play the piano, and she graciously obliged. And after a few selections, she asked if there was any song that the vice president would like to hear. And what did he request but Some Enchanted Evening? On October the 26th, so remember, they first met on July the 8th. We're now to October 26th. And uh, Jane and Alben both agreed that they didn't know how they agreed to get married. They weren't sure if he really proposed to her or if she proposed to him, but the end result was the same, that they had decided to tie the knot. Before they announced that to anyone, Alben went to personally visit each of his three children to tell them of his plans. Jane did likewise with her teenage daughters and her mother. And then he instructed Jane to notify the press that there would be a press conference at her apartment on October the 30th, just 4 days later, and and to tell the press that the vice president would be in attendance. They had anticipated that by having this press conference on a Sunday afternoon after church, there would only be 7 or 8 reporters who might show up. They were overwhelmed when over 50 reporters and radio broadcasters and all of these people filled Jane's apartment, multiple rooms of it. They couldn't fit into a space. But before the announcement was made, Alben Barkley telephoned President Truman to advise him that um, he had plans to marry. And of course, the president was elated. But he also explained at that moment that on November 18th, he couldn't come to St. Louis for the wedding. And the reason for that was that the Shah of Iran was coming to the United States on an official state visit, and Truman simply could not get away to the wedding in November. At that point, reporters for newspapers and magazines watched and recorded Jane's every move. She had people peering through the windows of her apartment trying to make photos. Um, Preparations for the wedding at St. John's Methodist Church uh, were very time consuming. And eventually she was so overwhelmed that she asked Alben for help. And in addition to that, she decided that if her apartment was going to continue as command central with the newly installed 3 telephone lines, all of which were ringing constantly, and people coming and going and trying to make her picture, that the best thing for her to do would be to secretly leave her apartment and stay at a friend's home. And she did. They figured out where she was, so it didn't really change a whole lot. But Alben Barkley sent another Kentuckian by the name of Billy Vaughn. And Billy Vaughn was Barkley's administrative assistant and worked with him from his days in Congress during his period as vice president and beyond. He was a native of Glasgow, Kentucky, and Barkley trusted him implicitly. So he sends Billy Vaughn to St. Louis to help out Jane and to organize the wedding and all that was necessary because the vice president was a part of this wedding party. Rather than flying, uh, which Jane had assumed he would do, and she was not happy when she learned that he was driving. But Billy Vaughn explained that he had to drive because he was driving the new Oldsmobile Rocket 88 convertible that the Veep had bought for Jane as a wedding present. So he was driving from D.C. to St. Louis, which was a bit of a drive in 1949. There were over 10,000 people that lined the streets of St. Louis outside the church the day of the wedding, and it was a huge affair, an intimate wedding, but huge in the fact that all of these people had descended uh, on the church, wanting to see, wanting to get in. And it also turned out that the security measures didn't work too well. And eventually, thanks to the Boy Scout troops of St. Louis, who had all come wanting to help with the wedding, uh, they helped to get the Veep and his bride from the church and into their waiting car. The couple honeymooned on Sea Island in Georgia. However, Jane had requested a chance to see South Pacific, and the vice president surprised her in the middle of the Sea Island honeymoon by jumping on a plane to New York City to see Mary Martin in South Pacific on Broadway. And of course, Some Enchanted Evening is one of the most well known songs from that musical. Their attempt to be discreet when entering the theater completely failed when people in the audience recognized them, and soon the buzz had interrupted the show. Everything was late, the house lights went up, and an announcement was made that the vice president and his bride had just entered the theater, much to Alban and Jane's embarrassment. And ever proper, they asked to go backstage after the musical had concluded to apologize to Mary Martin and the cast for interrupting the show by their arrival. And thus, the merry widower had crowned the queen of his a queen of his own, and he had brought resolution to the Missouri matter. Uh, from all indications, the couple had a wonderful time with each other. Uh, Jane became his true helpmate because Barkley's cataracts had gotten bad enough. He was no longer able to drive at one point, so she became his chauffeur. She organized his activities for him and was his constant companion and advisor on just about everything. Unfortunately, Jane didn't talk about too many of those things in her book, I Married the Veep, but she was present when Alban Barkley uttered his very well known last words in Virginia and was holding him in her lap, his head in her lap, when he passed away. Sadly, it was just a couple of years later, Jane had gone to work at George Washington University as an assistant to the university president, and she started writing this book, I Married the Veep. But sadly, she suffered a massive heart attack at age 52 and died. And she is interred in St. Louis next to her first husband. And unfortunately and sadly, she does not have a grave marker at her grave. So So there you have the Veep as the merry widower during 2 years of his career.
It's
All right, Bill.
interesting how much the press, we tend to think of these press swarms as part of the sort of current cable 24/7 fanaticism. But it sounds like the Washington media and the media was without, hot on the trail of people like Barkley, and it's very hard for him to have any privacy.
I believe that's correct, and it makes me recall the idea that there's really nothing new in the world. It's just being carried out by different people as the generations pass. So they certainly had to deal with the media at every turn.
You used a term. I wanted you to help make me hear it again. What did they call him? Sparkle something? Was it Sparkle
Sparkle, Barkle.
Barkle? I was also struck that when you ended and said that she did not have a tomb marker, that's really kind of sad.
It is. It is. It's very surprising.
Is
her husband has a large stone there. His name and his birth and death dates are on it, but Jane's name and dates were never engraved on the stone.
As an educator, I taught fifth grade social studies, and the school where I taught was very close to Barkley's grave. And I would teach about Barkley and let them learn a little bit about Barkley. And then we would take a walking tour down to the cemetery and visit his grave, so they'd be aware of who this man was, who all these things are named after.
Wonderful.
And, I'm planning in the future, hopefully soon. I know the woman who lives at Angles presently, and she's going to give me a tour.
Oh,
So
that would be
I'm
wonderful.
thrilled about that.
Yes.
And I will say, we have a place called Whitehaven, which is a rest stop here. And there's a Barkley, there are 2 rooms upstairs, which are all Barkley artifacts and so forth. His desks are up there and all other things. And every Christmas I play Ebenezer Scrooge. And my fee is that I get to use one of Barkley's canes as Scrooge, because he has a large collection up there.
Wonderful.
So he was a great man.
He was. He's a very interesting character, and I found this segment of his life fascinating because we know all of the political things. We know his admiration of Woodrow Wilson and his policies and all the different things that occurred during his years in politics. And yet there's this little slice of him that really is revealing of his personality in addition to Jane's. And we don't hear much about that. Most resources will give you a few lines at best about the fact that he met Jane Rucker at a party at Clark Clifford's home and they got married.
We do have a Market House Museum here in Paducah, and we have a Barkley room upstairs, all his artifacts. We even have the Surrey in which he proposed to his first wife, which is in there. But we do also have some invitations, or an invitation to his second marriage.
Mhm. Mhm. Interesting.
I don't remember if you said, Sam, she didn't have other children?
She had 2 children.
Oh, she did. Okay. That's right. I do remember you saying that now.
And apparently Alben Barkley loved the idea of being a stepfather to those daughters. He went to their college activities uh, as the stepfather, and they apparently adored him very much.
I was just going to ask about that because I wondered if they were opposed to the marriage and that's why he never got a marker on the grave or her name put on his stone. But it sounds like there wasn't any negative attitude towards him.
If there was, it does not come through in Jane's memoirs.
Okay, interesting.
And I think one of the things that has caused me to give some thought uh, to how our culture has changed from the time this was written in 1958 to the present. And if you were reading this story today, just as it's been presented by Jane and her ghostwriter, what would modern people think of that? I have a feeling there would be some people who would almost, conclude that Alvin Barkley was almost a stalker, and that he was really trying awfully hard to impress Jane,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
so it's a different world and different attitudes about those things from 1950.
It's interesting how he was able to get back and forth from Washington to St. Louis. We don't, that's fairly early for commercial aviation, and the train would be a few days. So I mean, just the logistics of the courtship are kind of impressive in terms of.
To go from meeting someone and then 4 months and a few days later marrying them is it's pretty impressive to have packed all of those activities into a relatively short period of time.
Are there any letters from Truman to Barkley, or any record of Truman observing this and what if anything he made of it?
I think he loved it. I think he thoroughly enjoyed the whole notion. Uh, the Trumans and the Barclays went to various social functions, of course, but they also did their own personal outings together. And in the memoirs, Jane writes about the first time that she invited the president and Mrs. Truman to come to their apartment for dinner, and all of the effort that was made to bring some more of Alvin Barkley's country hams from the smokehouse at Angle to St. Louis, because she had promised that she would provide a true Kentucky ham dinner to the president.
I also like the idea of borrowing the presidential yacht to take some friends out.
Yes.
I can see it now. Hey Joe, can I borrow Air Force One? I'd like to take some friends. Like to take some friends out for a weekend.
Well, and one of the interesting things they did on that evening cruise was just below Mount Vernon was Marshall Hall, which was an amusement park. And so they all got off the boat at the amusement park, and everyone was participating. And Jane writes about driving bumper cars, and who she was driving her car into, and all sorts of interesting things. And you think, oh my goodness, the Secretary of State and Sonny Whitney and all of these people, and they're in bumper cars at an amusement park.
Oh, what fun.
So Sam, are you doing any type of I didn't realize you spoke about Barkley. I didn't realize that was a part of your
Well,
genre.
It has not been until today.
Sam, are you aware of the McCall's magazine article, 1951, which is written by Jane Barkley, and it's called "This Is How I Keep House in Kentucky."
Wow.
And it's a great article, and it shows pictures of the stepdaughters in angles and so forth. It's a great story.
Yes, I will have to search for a second.
Yes, it is the March 1951.
Great.
Yeah.
Enjoyed about your Facebook columns is how you humanize and bring out the human dimensions of people. And I think this is not the great statesman. I mean, this is a human being, and it was wonderful. And
May I ask, is it Facebook page just under your name, Sam Terry?
Sam Terry's Kentucky.
Kentucky. Okay. Thank you. I want to get on that. That sounds wonderful.
I generally post one item each day of the calendar year, and the entries are based on something that happened in Kentucky history on that date on the
Oh,
calendar.
wonderful.
So
I'll have to catch
the
that.
subject matter hops and skips around.
Yeah, sure, sure.
And I think that is one of the things that has made the page very popular.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of people get bogged down when they try to learn history in chronological order, and they get bogged down with boring things that are not of interest, and they never get to great things like Alvin Barkley.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so it's kind of fun to just jump around. Today, the piece is about George Rogers Clark and his uh, troops disguised as Native Americans shooting the falls of the Ohio to eventually claim the old Northwest.